When the dust finally settled, the rains came, but so did the mud. In the middle of it all, one farmer's so-called stupid roof trick kept his shack dry when others were sinking beneath the weight of the storm. It was a decision that could save a life, but no one could see it coming. Before we dig into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories of survival against nature's fury move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale might just outlast this one. The sun had barely crept above the horizon when it started the first heavy rain of the season. For most, it was a welcomed relief after months of dust storms that had stripped the land bare, leaving nothing but cracked earth and the faint scent of dry air. But for Thomas Kelly, the downpour was just another test. His small farm was tucked away in a valley where the soil, once fertile, now seemed to repel any effort to grow. The well had run dry months ago, and his crops, what little had survived the drought, had turned to dust long before the rains came. He could hear the distant rumbles of thunder, and the wind whipped the branches of the few remaining trees near his shack. They bent like weary souls, surrendering to nature's inevitable wrath. By the time the first drops hit, the shack was already a symbol of stubbornness. The roof, hastily constructed of old tin, tar, and cloth, had always been an afterthought, the last thing on Thomas's mind. He had been too busy trying to salvage his crops, too busy making sure his livestock had enough water, too busy. But now the shack itself was the only thing left standing between him and the relentless flood. As the rain picked up, the ground turned to mud. It was a thick, soupy mess that made every step feel like a struggle. The shack, unprepared for anything beyond the relentless winds of the dust storms, now faced a different beast. The roof, patched together with whatever scraps he could find, was sagging under the weight of the rain. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and soon the mud was creeping under the door. Inside, Thomas did the only thing he could. He worked. With a grimace, he grabbed the small wooden ladder he had left leaning against the shack's frame. The rain was coming down so hard, the mud splashing around his boots, but he climbed anyway, balancing carefully as he made his way to the roof. Each step felt like it might be his last, but he had no choice. The structure had to hold. He wasn't going to lose it now, not after everything. The roof was slick, the cloth covering it soaked through, and the tin rattled in the wind. It looked like it might collapse at any moment. But then Thomas, hands trembling from the cold and the weight of the storm, placed one hand on the top of the roof and pulled the heavy tarp closer. His mind worked quickly, calculating. The trick he had used to seal the gaps, the stupid idea that everyone else had laughed at, was about to be tested for the first time. But he had a feeling it would hold even against nature's fury. The idea had come to him one evening, months before the storm. Thomas had been sitting in the small, dimly lit kitchen of his shack, staring at the ceiling. The roof had leaked for days after the dust storm had passed, and every time the wind howled, he could hear the groaning of the walls and the rattling of the roof. He couldn't afford to call a carpenter. He didn't even know who would come to a place so far out in the middle of nowhere. The weathered roof had to be patched up before the rains came again, and he knew he had to be resourceful. He had stared at the tin sheets hanging loosely from the rafters, the old tar paper curling at the edges. The edges of his thoughts sharpened. Everyone else had a roof like this, simple but vulnerable. The only way to make it hold through the mud and rain was to add weight. So he decided to do something no one had thought of: use cloth and sandbags to seal the gaps. The idea had seemed foolish at first. A flimsy roof, patched with cloth and filled with sand? What would that do but add more weight to an already sagging structure? Everyone who saw his work told him the same thing. "You're wasting your time, Thomas. That's no way to do it." But Thomas wasn't foolish. He knew that the rain would come eventually, and he knew that the mud that followed would make any other option impossible. So he worked quietly, ignoring the smirks of his neighbors, the whispers behind his back. He gathered every sack he could find, filled them with sand from the creek nearby, and piled them carefully on top of the roof, using the weight to keep the cloth and tar in place. It was a trick, a desperate one. But in the end, it was all he had. And, as the first rains of the season began to fall, he stood there, watching the clouds darken the sky. He just hoped it would work. But now, with the storm pounding against him, Thomas didn't need to hope. The cloth and sandbags had held fast, As he climbed up the ladder, the roof barely creaked under his weight. A small victory in a world that felt like it had already given up. The water had begun to pool around the edges of the shack, but the roof was dry, a small miracle in a land that seemed to promise nothing but ruin. The weight of the bags on top had kept everything in place, just as he had hoped. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive another night. And as the wind howled louder, Thomas knew that, for the first time in months, the storm wouldn't win. Not yet. The storm raged through the night. Thunder cracked like a whip, shaking the ground beneath the shack. By morning, the rain had intensified, pouring down in torrents. The small creek near Thomas's farm, which had once been a gentle trickle, had swelled into a churning, violent force. The wind gusted fiercely, pushing the water toward the low ground where his farm stood. Outside, the once barren landscape was unrecognizable. Mud had already begun to overtake the fields, inching closer to the shack's wooden frame, while the sky above seemed intent on unleashing more. The storm had caught everyone off guard, but Thomas wasn't as unprepared as the others. His roof, patched with sandbags and cloth, was holding firm against the relentless downpour. He had done what others thought was a foolish thing, and now that stubborn decision seemed like the one thing between him and disaster. Inside the shack, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth, the only warmth coming from the fire that flickered weakly in the hearth. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but Thomas barely noticed. He had more immediate concerns. The water was creeping up the edges of the shack. It had only been a few hours since the storm started, but already the small patch of ground near his door was starting to flood. Panic flickered for just a moment. It was the kind of panic that only came when survival was truly threatened. The shack, his shelter, was only meant to withstand the storms that came from above. It hadn't been designed to fight against the floodwaters that crept in from the surrounding fields. Thomas moved quickly, his heart racing as he grabbed his boots and headed for the door. The cold, muddy water lapped at his ankles as he stepped outside, bracing himself against the wind. He scanned the horizon, but all he saw were the other shacks of the nearby farms, all succumbing to the same fate. Some had already buckled under the pressure of the rain, their roofs caving in or slipping from the weight of the wet earth. Others were completely submerged, their walls crumbling into the rising tide. His neighbors, who had once laughed at his roof and his seemingly foolish ideas, were now in danger of losing everything. The floodwaters were rising fast, and Thomas knew he didn't have much time. He could see the distant hills rising above the flooded plains, the only safe place left. But it was too far to reach by foot. He turned back to the shack, the only thing he could rely on. His roof was the one thing keeping him safe. The sandbags had helped keep the water out, but now there was more coming in than he had ever anticipated. The ground around the shack had turned into a thick, sticky mud that sucked at his boots, making every step more difficult than the last. But there was something deeper than fear in his chest. There was resolve. He had prepared for a storm, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. Yet the roof held the weight of the sandbags. The trick that everyone had mocked had given him more than just a shelter. It had given him time to think, time to act. And so he worked. He grabbed what tools he had left, pulling ropes and extra tarps from the back of the shack. He secured the door, creating a barrier to keep the water from coming in any further. With quick hands, he adjusted the sandbags atop the roof, ensuring they were evenly placed. There was no time to lose. The days that followed were filled with water and mud. The storm had brought what felt like 100 years of rain in a single night, and now the world outside was nothing but an expanse of wet, sticky land. The floodwaters had receded slightly, but the damage had already been done. Thomas knew he was lucky. His shack had survived the worst of the storm, thanks to the trick that everyone had laughed at. But luck only stretched so far. By the third day of the storm, when the waters had crept up close to the foundation of his shack, Thomas knew that even his best efforts might not be enough. The ground had become unstable, and every day the walls of the shack seemed to groan a little louder as the earth around it shifted. He could hear it from inside, the faint crack of the wood under pressure, the sound of the land changing beneath him. But he wasn't about to give up now, not when he had worked so hard just to keep a roof over his head. He had made it through droughts, dust storms, and the loss of everything that once felt like security. If he could survive that, then surely This flood wouldn't be the thing that took him down. With the sky still dark and heavy above him, he made his way outside once more. The floodwaters had come to a temporary standstill, but he could see the way they still swirled around him, threatening to rise again at any moment. His neighbors were in worse shape than he was. Some had already abandoned their farms, packing up what little they could and fleeing toward higher ground. Others had taken refuge in the small town a few miles away, but not Thomas. The shack, despite everything, was still standing, and Thomas couldn't bear the thought of leaving it behind. The land he had worked so hard to claim, to nurture, was his. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. So he began reinforcing the walls again, patching up leaks and reinforcing his roof, knowing that the storm wasn't finished with him yet. In the evening, when the rain started to come again, Thomas sat by the fire, his boots still wet from his work outside. The shack was warm, at least, the fire crackling in the hearth providing some semblance of normalcy. The wind continued to howl outside, but it felt as if it were a different world now, one where the storm could rage and tear at the land, but couldn't break him. The weight of it all, the years of struggle, the uncertainty, the loss pressed in on him. But then, as he sat there alone in the quiet, a small, unexpected sense of peace settled over him. Maybe it was because of the roof, the one thing that had held firm when everything else seemed to crumble. Maybe it was because, for the first time in months, he wasn't fighting just to survive. He was fighting to protect something he had built, and that, more than anything, gave him hope. The storm finally broke just before dawn, and with it, the silence settled over the land like a blanket, heavy and still. The wind, which had screamed through the night, was now a whisper, carrying only the sound of distant thunder. The rain, which had fallen in torrents for days, had turned the ground into a thick, sticky bog, but the floodwaters were starting to recede. The world around Thomas Kelly's farm was battered, soaked, and broken, but it was still standing. His shack, though tired and weathered, remained upright, and so did he. Thomas stood at the door, peering out into the gray light of morning. The land stretched before him in a patchwork of mud, puddles, and debris. His farm, once a thriving stretch of fertile ground, had been ravaged. But what struck him most was the quiet. The earth had been torn apart, but it was still there, still breathing. And so was he. He'd made it through, somehow. He stepped out into the muck, his boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. The air was thick with moisture, and every step felt like a battle against the weight of everything he had fought for: the land, the crops, the life he had built. Yet it was the weight of the shack that had kept him going. The roof that everyone had called foolish, that trick with the sandbags, was the reason he hadn't lost everything. It had held firm through the storm, and now Thomas could see it for what it was, his lifeline. He walked around the shack, checking the corners where the floodwaters had crept up. There were patches of mud on the walls, stains from the rising water, but his roof was still in place, the sandbags and cloth tight against the tin. He ran his hand over the makeshift repairs, feeling the weight of each bag, each layer. It wasn't pretty, but it had worked. It had kept him dry when others hadn't been so lucky. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he turned to see one of his neighbors, a man from the neighboring farm who had stayed behind during the storm. He was walking slowly toward Thomas, his boots sinking deep into the mud. "Thomas," the man called out, his voice heavy with the exhaustion of the storm. "I don't know how you did it. We lost everything." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of the words. His neighbor's farm was gone, his shack had collapsed, and his livestock were lost. The man's face was hollow, eyes sunken from sleepless nights and the strain of survival. "I didn't do it alone," Thomas replied quietly, looking back at his shack. "Had to work with what I had. That roof, it wasn't much, but it was something." The neighbor stared at the roof, eyes wide with disbelief. "I thought it was a joke. You know, your sandbags and cloth looked like you were just wasting time. But now, seeing this, hell, I can't believe it." Thomas gave a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sometimes, you have to do the things no one understands, the things that don't seem to make sense at the time. And you hope it's enough. The neighbor didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded slowly. There was something in his eyes, now, a recognition, an acknowledgement that survival wasn't about pride or haste, but about preparation patience, and a willingness to act when everyone else was too busy laughing to see the storm coming. "Well," the neighbor said after a long pause, "I reckon I've learned something." "You were right about that roof. Might be the only thing that saved you." Thomas looked at the sky, where the storm clouds had finally parted, letting in a faint sliver of sunlight. The air was damp, and the ground was still a mess, but there was something about the stillness that felt different. The storm was over. "For now, I just did what I had to do," Thomas said, his voice low. "We all do. We keep going, because that's what we've got left." The neighbor nodded again and turned to walk away. But before he left, he called over his shoulder, "If you ever need help with anything, you just holler. I've learned my lesson. We stick together." Thomas watched him disappear into the distance, the weight of the storm still heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve stronger than ever. The shack was still standing, against all odds. It had held through the flood, the storm, and the mockery. It had kept him alive, and in a world that had forgotten the meaning of hope, that was enough. He turned back to his farm and walked toward the horizon, the earth beneath him still damp and uncertain, but his feet steady on the ground. The fight wasn't over, but he would keep going, just like the land, one step at a time.